Hi, my name is Ryan Tolman, and this is my final project for Psychopharmacology in the Masters of Social Work program at Northwest Nazarene University. The task for this presentation is to explain 5 of the most predominant drugs at my internship placement, which was District 7 drug courts in eastern Idaho. This is drug and alcohol treatment for felony and misdemeanor clients. They come via the court system, typically have failed multiple times in their treatment, and these folks come to us basically because they are facing significant jail or prison time. So I would like to gear this presentation towards maybe friends or family or concerned community members who have an interest in learning about substance abuse and the common drugs in our community. I think for me this helps me bring a passion and some life to this video, whereas otherwise it's just kind of a presentation just to get a grade. So anyway, just moving forward, just really thinking about how these things the drugs have evolved through history and policy, politics, etc., to bring us to the point that we're at today. So we'll get started by saying I was an intern at District 7 Drug Court from October 2014 to July 2015. I had 500 hours of internship supervised under a clinician, so a clinical social worker. I spent most of my time in group therapy as well as individual therapy, taking the lead in quite a bit of group therapy, usually co-facilitating in individual therapy. Because it is drug and alcohol treatment, the interns were not allowed to take their own clients. In other words, I had to have a supervisor in the room when I was providing treatment. The biggest concern or the most prevalent drug in my experience at drug court, so on my caseload of about 15 to 20 clients, was methamphetamines. And I'm guessing about 60% of our folks came in for methamphetamines. They're split between men and women. I think it was about equal, and most of them injected the drug. That was very surprising to me that so many people injected methamphetamines. I had always thought it was a drug which people snorted or smoked, and in my mind that really takes the addiction to a different level if you're willing to do that. And this class really elucidated the issues of communicable diseases, HIV, AIDS, hepatitis from dirty needles. And I'm very proud to say that District 7 treatment did have a program to test for hepatitis, AIDS, HIV, STDs. I believe it had a very high rate of attendance. In other words, most of the people got tested because they were, if they tested, they got out of going to a couple groups or a couple AA meetings. So by going to a brief presentation and getting tested in about 45 minutes, they could get out of about 3 hours of work, 3 to 4 hours of work. So the participants were very into it. The clients at drug court did get tested, so very hopeful in that way. Something else I'm hopeful of is that Idaho is funding this. It's funding drug court, and the drug court in East Idaho is considered one of the most successful in the nation in terms of outcomes in reducing recidivism. So a very, very good program, a very successful program. The last I heard, they were getting their funding cut, which is a little bit disappointing. And what we read in Ava and Cohen from 2011 really represents that treatment is the most viable option. The supply side reduction, the so-called war on drugs, really is not working and has not worked. Really ramped up in 1970 following the methamphetamine crystal meth epidemic. So yeah, let's start and talk a little bit about crystal meth. So Of all the drugs we're going to talk about today, meth is really the youngest, really being used in the last 100 years. So it was, amphetamines were really discovered in the late 1800s over in Germany. Around the turn of the century, 1893 to the turn of the century, the Japanese discovered a derivative of amphetamines called methamphetamines, and that's where we get the drug that we have today, the modern methamphetamine. It really was popularized in the 1930s. They used to use it as weight loss pills. They called ADHD something different, but they would use it for that. And they would also use it, for energy and things like that. And it was actually available over the counter until I believe 1959. So you could actually get methamphetamines at a drugstore. So one of the biggest turning points in methamphetamines was World War II. Before World War II, you could buy mostly pills for weight loss and things like staying awake, popular among truckers and things like that. In World War II, we have literally millions of guys around the world fighting, the Germans, the Americans, and the Japanese, the Allies versus the Axis. And all of these major armies used amphetamines in large amounts. The American forces used them in World War II in Vietnam. The Germans used them, and the Japanese used amphetamines. The Japanese also used amphetamines in their factories. So in order to ramp up their production for the war, they used methamphetamines in their factories. Pretty disturbing, I think, given the trend that we see now with the faces of meth and things like that, where meth is really taking people out left and right. So, yeah, World War II, big turning point, lots and lots of meth being manufactured and given to soldiers. After World War II, kind of continued to be used a lot as like diet pills in the United States, became a controlled substance, like I said, at the end of the 1950s, when they kind of noticed that it was a drug that could be abused and really shouldn't just be available without a prescription from a doctor. Also in Japan, they had so much methamphetamines, they had warehouses full of it after the war, and those warehouses wound up getting looted, and the methamphetamines were sold on the black market. So in Japan after World War II, they had a huge methamphetamines epidemic, and they actually classified methamphetamine addiction as a mental health problem and put people in for involuntary treatment. Very interesting too from Inaba and Cohen saying that involuntary treatment is effective for drug and alcohol use. So yeah, the Japanese did that to kind of turn the tide, and then they had a second epidemic kind of similar to the epidemic in the United States, which came a little bit later. So let's think to a time like in the 1960s, kind of the summer of love era, lots of sex, lots of drugs, LSD, pot, and limited availability of speed, because speed, as we said, kind of like 1959, wasn't available over the counter anymore, so truckers couldn't get it, people trying to lose weight couldn't get it. So in the Bay Area, California, kind of the center of the summer love hippie type movements, the biker gangs discovered that they could make meth fairly easily. So they started cooking meth there in the Bay Area, and it was called cranker speed. That's what the bikers called it, and became pretty readily available up and down the West Coast. So this is era 1967. By 1970, kind of the politicians really started to see this as a problem, and went ahead and kind of started the Drug Enforcement Agency, things like that. Later on in the Reagan era came the war on drugs, but really the beginning was about 1970. So they're really seeing these drugs as a social problem, a threat to the order of society. On the individual level, people are really ruining their lives with this stuff. So by the 1970s, there started to be, ramped up law enforcement. Methamphetamines was considered a Schedule II drug, and law enforcement went after it. At that point, it kind of became a game of cat and mouse between the meth labs and the and law enforcement, and the distribution of meth kind of continued out from the Bay Area up and down the West Coast and kind of made its way east. And then into the 80s and 90s, we started seeing more meth labs popping up, maybe coinciding with the internet and being able to get online and just see, hey, I can make that stuff and make a lot of money. There is a lot of money to be made in drugs. So yeah, really what meth does is it's a long-acting effect drug. So you take it and you could be up for 5-6 hours, you could be up for a day, you could be up for 2 days, you could be up for 3 days. So as opposed to other kind of uppers like cocaine, meth has a very long-term effect, a long half-life in the body compared to other uppers. So the downside, the upside of meth would be a lot of energy. I mean, this is what they were looking for in World War II out of their soldiers. But the downside is that it kind of burns out your neuroreceptors that make you feel pleasure. So on meth, you're gonna have a lot of energy. You're gonna feel really good, kind of similar to drinking a lot of coffee. Maybe everything is wonderful. It kind of feels like your birthday. These feelings kind of diminish as you continue to use the meth, and you're kind of chasing that original high. You want to get as high as you were, and that it just doesn't happen. The chemistry of the body doesn't allow for it. It just kind of burns up these neuroreceptors. Sad thing about meth, if you have family or loved ones who have done meth, the effects of meth can last a couple of months, a couple of years, or sometimes those neuroreceptors are burnt up for good. And to me, that is very sad. It means that your meth user might not enjoy sex. They might not enjoy, family outings, time with their kids, things that they should be happy about. Really, they're not getting a sense of pleasure because they burned up those receptors. So neurologically, very damaging, the methamphetamines. Other things that are like rotting teeth, open sores. You can feel like you're itching, feel like things are under your skin. So very nasty stuff, and the researchers are saying get treatment, and even more so, don't even try it. And my message, like to kids and stuff like that, is just like, this stuff feels really good, but it's fake. The stuff that you're taking is fake, and it will not last forever. And very important just not to do it. The Meth Not Even Once campaign, I'm fully on board with that. This stuff is highly, highly addictive. Your first, second, third high might be great, but it's going to diminish from there. I think that's where we saw a lot of these folks shooting because, being efficient addicts, injection is the most efficient way to get it in your body, followed by smoking it. So, these folks are just trying to get back to that point where they were at, where they felt really good. And just the long-term side effects, kind of extreme weight loss, burning up neurotransmitters that make you feel pleasure, things like that. Just really not worth it. So, meth was the most predominant at District 7. About 60% of my clients were there for meth. Very, very nasty stuff. I would say the demographics of my folks, like I said, male, female, probably mid-20s to mid-30s, usually lower socioeconomic status, maybe high school graduates, usually no college, maybe didn't graduate high school but got their GEDs, like working construction for the guys, working at gas stations for the ladies. I've been in mental health for a long time, really enjoyed my time with these folks, but finding the addictions piece very, very different. So that's kind of a wrap-up of the history of meth. Another good point is that these guys, as biker gangs back in the 60s, actually, were producing crystal meth, which is like 60% stronger than regular methamphetamine. And we'll see that theme. We'll see that theme in the rest of the drugs we're using, is that the human race seems to have a propensity to really ramp up the intensity of their drugs. So you'll see that with other things like alcohol, where they started distilling alcohol into hard liquor, things like opium, going from opium to heroin, and such. Marijuana, increasing its potency many times over from the 1960s to today. So yeah, move on to alcohol. So yeah, we saw that methamphetamines is a relatively new phenomenon, about 100 years old or so in the United States. So alcohol, much older drug. Alcohol was first used, we think, about 11,000 years ago. And they're guessing that Neanderthals might have eaten spoiled fruit up to 50,000 years ago. They're thinking that maybe they saw things like deer or animals eating spoiled fruit acting funny, so they decided to try it themselves. So alcohol, much older. Methamphetamines going back about 100 years. Alcohol going back about 11,000 years. Alcohol, so methamphetamines is an upper, alcohol is a downer. So alcohol is more of a depressant. You're going to get some euphoria from it. A few drinks will start to affect your motor skills. A few more will cause aggression. More and more will cause really a depressant effect. You get sleepy, you can black out, you can pass out, and you can die. So kind of funny thing about alcohol, very legal. Prohibition really didn't work in the 1920s to 1930s. But really powerful stuff. So yeah, alcohol and benzodiazepines are two drugs that you can die on from withdrawal. So yeah, kind of interesting in my internship that alcohol is legal, so people tend to take it lightly. I think that my methamphetamine clients were a lot less likely to relapse, it seemed like. And the alcohol guys were just kind of like, oh, it's just a beer, construction worker after work, I can have a beer. Whereas the meth people, like, it was very spelled out in their social groups and their family, like, don't touch that stuff. It is disgusting, it is wrong, it'll ruin your life. Where you're alcoholic, oh, just have a beer, buddy, you know what I mean? And that's not to say that the methamphetamines user didn't have that pressure, but it's much different as far as societal norms, considering alcohol and methamphetamines. So yeah, the literature is really showing that the problem of alcohol is directly related to kind of the politics, the policy, and the law behind alcohol. Some authors argue that really, what's the problem with alcohol unless there's laws against it? And I've heard of that. I heard of that in my internship, that really in places in Europe there is no alcoholism. Just because, if dad or grandpa or mom drinks a lot, just kind of the family rallies around them and props them up and gets them back to work, or keeps them functioning. And that's different cultural norms. So over the course of time, alcohol has fallen in and out of favor. Arab cultures banned it, which actually resulted in an increase in marijuana use, kind of in some of the Arab cultures, because the Quran banned the use of alcohol or prohibited the use of alcohol. But here in the United States, we have some time periods. So say through the Revolutionary War, so say the 14, 15, 1600s up through the 1700s, America's a pretty rural place. Alcohol really was not regulated. They started to regulate it to make money off of taxes. Profit's always a big motivator in America. But really unregulated, really not seen as a social problem. Lots of liquor, lots of beer. The early beer had protein in it. It was had a lot more grain. It was healthier. It wasn't as watered down as the modern stuff. It wasn't as strong either. So they're drinking a lot of beer. They're drinking alcohol in the 1700s. 1800s come around, and there's a doctor named Benjamin Rush who wrote a paper in the 1800s saying basically that alcohol was a concern, the rise of drunkenness was a concern, and people should not drink. He saw a lot of people were going to the hospital for alcohol, which was a concern. And also we were talking about taxes. They started taxing wine and beer and liquor kind of at the same rate. So people were like, hey, if I can buy 1 quart of beer or 1 quart of hard liquor and pay the same tax, I'm going to buy 1 quart of hard liquor because I'm going to get much, much more drunk off 1 quart of hard liquor. So in the 1800s, hard liquor really started to become the most predominant use of alcohol. In other words, people drank a lot more hard liquor. And authors like Levine 2012 figured this is one of the big reasons for the social movements that came about at the turn of the century, temperance movements and things like that. Because people were just getting hammered. They used to drink beer and it had some nutritional value, and they were just starting to drink a lot of hard liquor. So yeah, we saw the rise in hard liquor. We saw the temperance movement leading up to Prohibition. Prohibition lasted from I believe 1920, 1933. They got rid of it during the Great Depression. It really didn't work, and I don't know that that's a fair blueprint to say that kind of the war on drugs and prohibition could be compared. I'm not sure that's apples to apples. But it kind of is. Really, prohibition did not work. Just as many or more people drank, and the money, instead of going towards legitimate businesses, went to the organized crime, to the underworld, to the black market. So basically, yeah, through the early years, through the Revolutionary War era, just very laissez-faire towards alcohol. Not a lot of regulation, not a lot of caring about it. Not really seeing it as a social problem. And then the increased use of hard liquor in the 1800s. And then really kind of coming into the forefront after World War II, we had better roads, faster cars, and guess what? People were drinking a lot, and then they were driving. Alcohol is responsible for about 40% of the fatalities on the road. So this was when alcohol was really starting to be seen as a social problem. Directly reflected in my experience at District 7. All the folks that I saw in there for alcohol, it was for drinking and driving. It was for DUIs. I think maybe in different settings you'd see more domestic violence, and that might be kind of a cross-cutting or comorbid occurrence, domestic violence and drinking. Just because the more past moderate drinking, you tend to get aggressive, lose inhibitions, things like that. Yeah, gets us kind of the point we are today. The federal law is still very laissez-faire towards alcohol. They set the minimum drinking age, and very little else. They leave it up to state and local governments to regulate it, things like selling liquor licenses, getting bars and restaurants licensed. Big business, about 75, I believe, billion with a B, dollars a month is grossed by places like restaurants, liquor stores, and things like that in liquor sales. Yeah, 75 billion with a B per month. So yeah, alcohol really, really, really big business. And kind of comparing Prohibition to the war on drugs again. The war on drugs, yeah, lasted from 1920 to 1933 and cost the American taxpayers $11 billion. So very costly, largely non-effective. I think research shows that that's the truth in the modern war on drugs as well. They're finding treatment, so every dollar you spend on treatment saves $1 up to $39 in legal justice costs and law enforcement costs. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to go to treatment. Very proud to be involved in a place like District 7 treatment, drug court that was so effective. So yeah, the next most prevalent drug was marijuana. We're not finding a lot of, I didn't in my internship find a lot of marijuana users. We had a couple guys. We had a guy who used marijuana for chronic pain, and then a guy who grew marijuana and seemed to really take a lot of his social status from being a pot grower. So he was in for manufacturing, and then we had a young man in there for self-medicating chronic pain. So marijuana runs on a little bit of a similar timeline as alcohol. Marijuana was cultivated in Central Asia, so think like Mongolia, Afghanistan area. Very old. One of the, excuse me, one of the first drugs cultivated by human beings. In other words, it was a wild plant, and then human beings saw use of it. They could eat the seeds. They could use the fibers, very strong fibers, and then of course eat the buds for their psychoactive properties. So yeah, I think about the same era as the beginning use of alcohol or fermentation of alcohol was the first use of marijuana. So about 11,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. So yeah, methamphetamine is a very new drug. Alcohol and marijuana very old. Kind of similar to alcohol, marijuana fell in and out of favor with different societies. We discussed kind of the Arabs in the Quran and things like that, and because of that, you know, alcohol was not allowed in the Arab nations, so they would tend to use marijuana. They took the oils and the resin from marijuana and made something called hashish, which they would eat, and that goes back very, very far. That goes back you know, 1,000 years ago, documented use of hashish and eating it. Medical marijuana use, first documented by the Chinese in the year 200, so very, very old, ancient use of medical marijuana. Yeah, we've kind of looked at how meth distribution kind of fanned out from the Bay Area, and we kind of see the same thing with marijuana. As especially the early Aryans, so the white Western Europeans came over to trade in Mongolia. On the Asian steppes, they took marijuana with them and kind of spread it through Europe and North Africa. Really seemed to take on more of a role in North Africa, where they, you know, made the hashish and would eat that. And marijuana has a history of use, you know, for medicine, for recreation, and for spiritual use. So I don't think there's as much of a spiritual use, certainly for alcohol or methamphetamines. I've not seen in the literature that there's been the use of alcohol or meth for spiritual uses, but certainly do see it for marijuana. We're not going to discuss psychedelics, but marijuana is kind of considered a psychedelic. And I guess it would be good to say, and Abba and Cohen from 2011 describe marijuana as an all-arounder. They say meth is an upper, alcohol is a downer, and marijuana is an all-arounder. Now what this means in this sense is that marijuana kind of affects people differently. It kind of affects you upon your environment and mood. It can pick you up like a stimulant, or it can bring you down like a depressant. It can be a mild hallucinogen. You know, some of the health effects are maybe effects on your lungs, memory loss. You can't remember things as well anymore, and things like that. Kind of your marijuana user will be kind of spacey, and Alba and Cohen are saying maybe 2 to 3 months after a heavy user stops using marijuana, they kind of come out of a mental fog. So when you're using a lot of pot, you're kind of in a fog, maybe not noticing things that are going on as well, kind of in your own little world. So anyways, yeah, the Western Europeans kind of spread this stuff out. It was, yeah, it's really almost the same as today in America. You know, people see it as medical use, recreation use, spiritual use, things like the Rastafarians and the Jamaicans. And controversial back then, you know, eventually the Arabs in North Africa and the Middle East also said no to marijuana. You know, they weren't into alcohol, and they eventually were strict and not being tolerant of marijuana anymore. In America, very interesting history. So similar to other drugs, like your methamphetamines weren't regulated, alcohol wasn't really regulated until the turn of the century. Neither was marijuana. Marijuana is actually a Schedule I drug, which means it has a high potential for abuse and being addictive, and it has no medical use. this really doesn't make sense according to popular sentiment, how voters feel. Half the people in America think that pot should be legal. 23 states have it legalized for medical use. Even the District of Columbia has pot legalized for recreational use. So why is it a Schedule I drug? The reason why marijuana is a Schedule I drug is it comes from the Great Depression, and really having a lot of Mexican workers up in the U.S. and anti-immigrant sentiment, as happens in poor economies, saying that these immigrants are taking our jobs, we need to send them home. So the answer at that time was to make marijuana a illegal Schedule I drug eventually, and send people home who smoke marijuana. Well, the people who smoke marijuana were migrant workers, so these are people coming up from Mexico to work. And they said, aha, we can send these guys home if we can catch them with pot. So actually the state of California, I think in 1909, was the first state to regulate marijuana use, eventually coming forward with a tax act, which was overturned, and the state started taking control and just booting people out, especially in the Southwest, where we had a lot of Mexican migrant workers. So yeah, kind of a politically constructed war on marijuana there in order to kick immigrants out of the U.S. And I did in my paper cite a PBS site that had an article on that, as well as Inaba and Cohen mention it in their textbook. So yeah, I think if your family or loved one has a marijuana user, kind of the biggest thing that we saw in drug court was, hey guys, what you're doing is illegal. Go to Colorado or Washington if you want to do this. You're going to have memory loss. You're not going to be as sharp. You might have long-term cognitive effects. If you drive with it, that is illegal. So the impaired driving and things like that. As far as reducing harm, I would say that, in my opinion, meth would be very, very devastating to a person's life. As well as alcohol and potentially marijuana, but maybe not as high risk of an abuse as the first two drugs that we talked about. Yeah, I feel like saying, are there any questions, but I don't really have an audience right now. So we have those three, and then so I'll get on to our last two. Really not a lot of people using our last two. One of them is prescription opiates, or like OxyContin. We get people in who have like chronic back pain, or they had an injury, and those folks are saying like, yeah, I had an injury. Unfortunately, they're doing things like driving while they're high, obtaining the drugs from illegal sources, getting caught with a drug without a prescription. I have a lot of concern. Actually, I'm doing my research on the psychiatric or psychological treatment of chronic pain, because it seems like they're handing out so many opiates to so many people, and it just seems to me as a drug and alcohol counselor like it's such a bad idea. And I'll tell you why it's a bad idea. These things are very, very addictive. Research is showing that the drug companies are just pumping these drugs into the market. OxyContin was just approved, I believe, for like 11-year-olds. So they're pumping these drugs out in the market, and they're really not being regulated. The FDA has an obligation to make sure that these drugs are used correctly, and they are not following through with their obligations. Doctors lack time and obligation, and research shows that doctors really don't enjoy handing these pills out. They do not enjoy working with these patients, so like pain patients getting opiates. So yeah, really focusing on OxyContin. These modern opiates like codeine came out in the mid-1800s, so we're talking about pills that you can take, very powerful, similar theme to marijuana, not really regulated until this turn of the century. You could actually buy heroin. Our textbook has you could buy a syringe and heroin like out of a Sears and Roebuck catalog. A lot of heroin use and opiate use following the Civil War, so think about that area rolling into the turn of the century, and the patent medicines, which would have like laudanum and things like that, which actually had opium, morphine, heroin in them. So yeah, OxyContin kind of comes out of that group. So OxyContin, what it is it's a time-release pain reliever, originally marketed, it's an opiate, originally marketed in the year 2000. by this company, Purdue Pharma, and they initially marketed it as a non-addictive painkiller that a doctor could give somebody. So you give them one pill and it lasts like 2 to 3 days. The person wouldn't get addicted, they wouldn't get high. Turns out that was a lie, a huge lie. 2007, they were sued, they pled guilty and lost money to the tune of $6 million in a fine from the FDA, the biggest fine ever made towards a drug company. Yet we still have OxyContin, like I said. Now it is approved for kids to use. So very scary stuff to me as a drug and alcohol counselor. Also being sensitive to the fact that people have pain. You know, they have a lot of pain, but it's really just kind of flooding the market with this stuff. So comparing it like to the age of other drugs, you know, opiates have been around forever, starting as opium and things like that, and really similar to other drugs, the potency has increased a lot over the years. So now we got this latest generation of opiate, this OxyContin, that really caught on. Purdue Pharma, when they saw how well it was selling initially, doubled their sales force. So they're going all over the U.S. with drug reps, you know, selling the stuff to all these pain clinics, all these doctors, touting it as the latest, greatest. And turns out it just has this huge potential for abuse. People can cook it and shoot it, grind it up and snort it, smoke it. It's just nasty stuff. So yeah, lots of physical and mental dependence. This stuff will get you very high. It's a downer like alcohol. Kind of puts you in your own world, makes you numb. You can't feel anything. Similar to meth, it'll kind of burn up your receptors. Similar to meth, alcohol, and marijuana, you're going to get that initial high from it that you cannot get again. Your body intolerance and things. You might be able to do it once, quit for a year, and kind of almost get to that high, but you're left chasing that high, and you're left without the ability to feel pleasure. Not nearly as much research out there on OxyContin because it's so new. When we're talking about something like marijuana that's 11,000 years old, or alcohol that's similar. Methamphetamines also had less research than alcohol or marijuana, but OxyContin is pretty new stuff. And just kind of scary in that the manufacturers are legal manufacturers. The use is condoned by medical doctors and the establishment, and it is highly addictive. Similar to some of the other drugs we've talked about. If you have loved ones that are on these, get them into treatment. Do not enable them in their use. Very important to get them into treatment through any door that is available. So yeah, OxyContin, kind of the history from 1850 to present, similar to marijuana in regulation, and yeah, eventually coming to this latest generation like OxyContin that's heavily marketed, widely available, easily available, highly addictive, highly abusable drug. So yeah, and then like I said, we saw that in chronic pain patients. So our last drug, the least prevalent drug that I saw in District 7 Drug Court is heroin. Not a lot of heroin. The heroin use that we saw was injection use. People would say it was more prevalent than it seemed. In other words, if our drug court clients wanted to get heroin, they could get heroin. So yeah, heroin, you know, kind of in the same line as the OxyContin, opiate. You know, opium was originally around a long time ago. Looking for my number on the opiates, but I think it's similar to marijuana. It's very old. Used for medicine, like the Greeks used it for medicine, used opiates, and for religious purposes. The Greeks also used they used alcohol, but they also used marijuana for spiritual purposes. And so yeah, opium was used in the same way. Heroin was actually came about at the same time, kind of the similar same era to like codeine, which is a predecessor to OxyContin, and the amphetamine, kind of around the turn of the century. Heroin was originally considered a better form of morphine. I think it's like 50-60% more pure than morphine, so it hits a lot harder than morphine. It was used for like coughs and tuberculosis and things like that. It really would keep you from hacking, which is really important. If you're going to hack up a lung and you can take this prescription drug that'll make you stop, think like codeine cough syrup, which is still available today. Heroin was really kind of a miracle drug. If you're having surgery, you're having your leg cut off or something like that, or amputated, heroin's a really good thing. But what they found that heroin is very, very, very addictive, and withdrawals are horrific. So yeah, heroin was originally manufactured around the turn of the century, kind of similar with marijuana and things. They started regulating it before World War II, saw prevalence kind of in the 60s, and still is around today. So yeah, we had a client. What I see really with my heroin clients was, it almost seemed like they had been somewhere amazing, like they had gone on an amazing trip or done something really amazing, and there was a sense of melancholy, like they couldn't get back there, like something amazing happened, and then they were sad, and just really trying to search for happiness and pleasure in life without those drugs. So yeah, I'm seeing the numbers now on heroin. About 6,000 years ago is when the poppy was cultivated by humans. So about 5,000 years after marijuana was cultivated, about 5 or 6,000 years after alcohol was being fermented. Kind of similar place it came from, which is Afghanistan area, Burma area, place like that, the Silk Road, Southeast Asia. That's where heroin still comes from, is there, and down in Colombia, Peru area are large trade routes for heroin. So yeah, primary use is injection, and it's been around for a long time. My folks had done it, after their withdrawals, they're kind of left like, what just happened? Kind of that sense of sadness, like I'm not going back to that ever again. But if presented the opportunity, it's just like, imagine being presented with the most amazing thing that had ever happened to you and having to say no. I think that's similar to the meth addicts, how they think. I think meth is a bit of a harsher drug, and there seemed to be more of a romanticism surrounding heroin use. In fact, when it was developed, it was the word heroin, like a female hero, that was developed in marketing that drug. So yeah, that's kind of my wrap-up of my experience in drug court with drugs. Predominant drug, methamphetamines; second, alcohol; third, marijuana; fourth, OxyContin; and then finally heroin. Yeah, just really feeling right now like I should ask for questions. But yeah, that's it. I'm going to post this up on YouTube. If you have friends or loved ones, ask for help. Call your local health department, see what kind of funding there is available for drug and alcohol use. In Idaho, it's BPA funding that may be available, things like that. Don't be part of an enabling system. If you got friends, family who need money or something, and you think they're going to go buy dope, alcohol, things like that, really the best thing to do for these folks is to get them help. And it's sad, but oftentimes research is showing they need to hit rock bottom before they get help. So yeah, that's my wrap-up of the history and use of drugs, these drugs that we find in East Idaho in drug court. Hope this is informative and helpful, and yeah, appreciate your time.